Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this webinar. We had some technical issues which have now been resolved, hopefully. And if you are joining us on the YouTube stream, you are at the right place. And yeah, so we'll kick this off. Thank you to our panelists for being patient and waiting while we're resolving this. Right, so the telecommunications industry in South Africa and across Africa has the ability to change the market, change economies, or at least add positively to society. And today we'll look at some of the trends that are shaping this industry, some trends and insights that will shape the industry going forward, especially in the South African context, and just look at some insights and trends with regard to the communication space, the advertising, and where brands are investing and what that tells us about where the industry is thinking, or at least where the industry is, or at least where the industry itself is looking at driving what people receive in as far as the telecommunications and connectivity space is concerned. Before I introduce our panelists, I would like to hand over to my colleague, Mbuluma Silumbwe, who is the Senior Social Media Analyst at Ornico, to give us some trends and talk to some insights that are driving communication and advertising, as well as advertising spend, which will then lay the groundwork for our discussion with our panelists. So, Mbuluma Silumbwe, over to you.
All right, thank you, Gezi. Appreciate that. I will just share my screen. So we'll start by looking at newcomer ads. Newcomer adverts are ads that have flighted for the first time within a particular period of time. Between January 2019 and October 2020, we looked at just over 4,000 newcomer ads. And looking at a breakdown by month, we can see that 2020 recorded far less newcomers as compared to 2019. As can be expected, April and May received the lowest number of ads, mainly due to the lockdown. In terms of a breakdown by medium, we can see that internet and television were the only mediums that received an increase. It was also expected that print mediums saw a dramatic decline, and 2020 also saw the loss of several iconic titles, such as the likes of Cosmopolitan, House and Leisure, Good Housekeeping, as well as some publications moving from print to having online versions only. In terms of the top 10 brands, there was a decrease compared to last year across the board. However, we also saw one of the largest declines being Cell C, which is understandable considering the current financial position. They recently reported a 7.5 billion rand loss in revenue ending June 2020. In terms of types of advertisements, we see that the most favored ones are corporate as well as promotion. And in terms of CSI, very little was done in both years, 2019 and 2020. Looking now at product promotions, little has changed between 2019 and 2020, with the focus still being on Samsung Galaxy as well as Huawei. Switching now to ad spend, and we're not just looking at newcomers, we're looking at all adverts for television and radio only. And here are the top 15 adverts that accounted for 82% of all the ad spend between January 2019 and September 2020. In terms of share of voice, most of the ad spend went to television. And looking at a breakdown by month, we can see a significant dip in April during the lockdown and a subsequent recovery immediately after, particularly in relation to television. In terms of a breakdown by month, looking now at the top 10 stations by number of ads, we can see that in terms of television, the terrestrial stations accounted for most of the ad spend. This is normal as they are slightly more expensive. However, they also do have a higher reach. Looking at radio, we can see the prime media stations 947, KFM, 702 were clearly a popular choice when looking at radio advertising. Just looking now at some of the key headlines, we can see that some of the Cell C's financial difficulties made headlines there. We can also see the availability of spectrum plus the delay of it, the launch of 5G in South Africa with Vodacom and MTN in reign. Lastly, looking at social media, we looked at the last 3 months and we looked at some of the major conversational drivers. And some of the topics involved data pricing as well as complaints around network coverage as well as turnaround time. Looking at share of voice, Vodacom was the most talked about brand, followed by MTN. Some of the conversational drivers for Vodacom were mainly in relation to sponsorship, particularly rugby, as well as here and there some complaints around data costs. Yep, so that's me. Thank you very much, Mungadze. Pass it on back to you.
Thanks, Mbuluma. Thank you very much for that. Right, so that was Mbuluma, the senior social media analyst at Ornico, just taking us through some of this ad spend and conversations that took precedent, or at least that took priority in the media space. Now introducing our panel. Melody Maker is the digital partner at MNC Saatchi Abel. Raj Wanniappa is the founder and CEO of Future Horizon Technologies. We are also joined by Samuel Mungadze, a senior journalist at ITWeb. Just after looking at those trends, Melody, I'll start with you. Have you noticed any specific industry changes in the telecommunications and general connectivity space in the past few months that inform how you advise clients around their strategy?
Sure. So I think it's not only really telecoms brands, but I think in general, everyone's feeling the pinch, especially consumers. So I think there's quite a lot of spend reduction. I think loyalty is shifting with consumers changing spending habits based on these financial constraints. And I think obviously there's also been a huge shift, which we actually saw in the report that we just looked at now, a huge shift to digital and I suppose omni-channel due to COVID. And I think as a result, there's real consumer fatigue. I think we're overloaded more than ever with online brand messaging. And I think generally with the brands that we work with, we really advise them to start with what matters in the lives of consumers that they're engaging with and try find an interesting way to intersect your brand in a relevant way. Obviously quite a different type of brand, but I think Burger King does a phenomenal job at this with their approach, which they've coined as hackvertising. And I don't know if you saw their recent campaign that they did where they sponsored Stevenage, which was a super low-level team in FIFA. And essentially what they did, I mean, no one had any interest in this team because they just lost everything. They're completely at the bottom of the league. And they sponsored their shirts. And in doing so, knew that their shirts would also appear in the FIFA game. And what Burger King did was they encouraged consumers to use star players in their Stevenage FIFA games and to post them online, and they could win food vouchers. And I think this was just such a smart way to get the top players in the world wearing their brand, albeit in a virtual sense, and a really tactical and interesting approach to intersect with the consumer passion point and then also their brand in an unexpected way. And I think obviously it is quite challenging, but it's something that we try to encourage our brands to do, is to really try to find a relevant way to intersect your brand into the consumer's world, especially since I think online is so super overloaded at the moment. You really have to find an interesting way in versus just adding to the noise.
And I think, I mean, back to what Mbu was saying as well, that a lot of brands got a lot of at least attention on social media as a result of their sponsorships or the sponsorships that they put out there. And now with people not, say, going to stadiums to watch the rugby, for instance, that becomes, that changes at least the status quo in terms of how they communicate and what they are able to communicate.
Exactly. And I think it was O2 that actually did a recent, I think it was a virtual rugby game, actually utilizing, I think it was 5G, just to try to bring that to life. So I think obviously we know, especially I suppose in South Africa, sport is a huge passion point. But again, you have to try and find a relevant way to intersect with that in the consumer's life.
Absolutely. Samuel, in terms of, the trends that you've noticed in recent times shaping what the industry is doing, as well as the research that you're doing for the various stories that, you've written in the past couple of months, what are some of the overarching trends that you're noticing? Samuel, just give me a second. You're muted there. Let me just unmute you. Okay, sorry about that, Samuel. Yeah, please carry on.
So I'm saying, for me, there are about 3 outstanding trends that I would point out. The first one, this is in the telecoms industry, obviously. The first one being the Internet of Things. In short, we're referring to devices connected through the internet. Yeah. And this has become a very important trend, I think, for the sector, both for the telcos themselves, because they use this to monitor their base station data centers, as well as maintaining their network. And outside that, for personal use, people are using IoT devices at home, in mines, in different places. So I think there is a growing demand for IoT services, technology rather, and
okay, you're hanging there, Samuel. But I mean, I heard you on the IoT. I just wonder, though, with our general access to data and general access to fiber and the internet, how how connected, or how much more we'll need in terms of connectivity to be able to utilize connected devices. But we'll come back to that. I think we'll come back to that as soon as we've sorted out Sam's connection there. Raj, what are some of the trends that you've noticed, I guess, in your dealings with, I suppose, startups, with technology companies, and everything else that you're looking at from a technology perspective, as well as connectivity, that are shaping the industry or will be shaping the market going forward?
Yeah, Mungadze. So, I mean, we can look at it with a couple of perspectives. The first is the here and now, which is, for instance, how South Africa responded collectively to the pandemic to make sure that business continued, and then the future. So let me start with the here and now, because that gives an idea of where we are at the moment and where we're moving to. Is, I would rate how South Africa performed probably as about a B-. In other words, many during the shutdown, many companies had to have their employees work from home. The students had to do the same. You saw people having Zoom calls in cars, once travel was permitted. And so you got a blend of both fixed wired and wireless technology. So if they were at home, in general, they were using, the home Wi-Fi, but then they had to go and collect their kids from school, and then they jumped onto their cellular network. And, I participated in many of them, and, you saw calls dropped. I mean, even now Sam is out of the call at the moment. So if you ask about, that's why I rate it about a B-, because yes, we managed to get things done and work happened, but was it effective or not? Now, when you compare it with some of the other countries, and that's what I want to get to in the future, and the future lies in, getting a ubiquitous network connectivity network where you ensure, for instance, that dropping does not happen and is seamless, and there's interconnectivity between the different mediums, the technology mediums, as well as the service providers. And so in South Africa, we have this anomaly that, a lot of the wireless networks are being dominated by mostly Vodacom and MTN, with the likes of Telkom, Cell C, the likes of Rain, and a couple of other startups, nipping on their heels. But still, if you do not have that interconnect with those two, then really it's not going to happen, both from a price perspective as well as from a performance perspective. When we start to look at what's coming down the horizon, and you look at things like autonomous cars, Tesla as an example, but any electric vehicle, for instance, the amount of data, that's being produced and needs to be collected, the camera data that needs to be analyzed and either in the car or moved to the cloud is enormous. And quite honest, at the moment, there is just no ways that South Africa is ready for us to be able to meet the demands that's coming our way. So in the short term and medium term, we have to start to get ICASA, the likes of ICASA and the Department of Telecommunications, to really start a rapid fire way of getting things like spectrum out, but also investment to allow the players, the fiber providers, the network providers, really capacitated to be able to then deliver to the consumer demand, because the consumers are going to demand it. As soon as electric vehicles and autonomous cars start to happen around the world, South Africa is going to be there. We can't afford to be 5 years behind.
Mm. And I mean, I'll get back to some of the, I'll get back to, some of the data that it will then enable us to collect. And also I think the demands that places on various networks, as well as access to fiber. But one of the things that you make mention of is obviously the changes that were brought about by the pandemic. And one of those things is, or at least one of the things that's spoken about, is that data and connectivity have taken preference over voice and voice calls. Have you noted any changes in how the industry itself has begun to sort of posture or communicate, Raj, its intention with this in mind, or with this change that has come about?
Yeah, if you even look at any individual at the moment, I would say the demand for voice, as in a normal phone call, has gone down to maybe 10% of the amount of usage of that connectivity. Meaning, 1 out of 10 calls probably, you dial on the normal voice line. All the others are through alternative means, WhatsApp, Skypes, even through Zoom. The number of Zoom calls we have as business, you can imagine. So there's no need to then call the individual on either their cellular line or landline, even worse, which I don't know the last time I've made a call on that. But so it's not easy. We must give credit to the network providers, that they still need to keep capacity in their networks to allow for that, but at the same time cater for this explosion of demand for data. And I think in a way we were caught short, and you saw that specifically when in the midst of the pandemic we also had load shedding, the dreaded word.
Yeah.
And basically when that happened, I think almost the country came to a halt. Because at that point if you're trying to dial out, it was impossible, and that is indication that everyone had jumped onto the fixed and mobile networks. But as soon as power cut off in the local exchanges or at home or in businesses, literally you become quiet. And we cannot be in a situation like that. When you then look at alternatives that are coming, not alternatives, but alternative solutions that are coming, I want to bring up specifically a project, because I deal in innovation, a project driven by Elon Musk's company called Starlink. And Starlink is the use of satellites, the plans to put almost 50,000 smaller satellites into orbit to be able to cover the entire world and offer connectivity in a very price competitive as well as performance method. And I think if we look in the horizon, although at the moment the focus is in North America and some parts of South America, it's going to come to Africa and South Africa, and that'll be intense competition for our current service providers to be able to compete with that, because essentially they will be the Amazon of e-commerce or Amazon of telecommunications, where it becomes a commodity.
And I want to come back to that too. I think to the competition aspects. But before we do, Melody, I just want to bring you in here a bit, because I think the competition part is going to, or at least it's expected to grow in the next year, as there's talk of increased spectrum, there's talk of more networks coming into play. But also, besides the three big networks, there are also sort of broadband and fiber providers that are coming in, right? That are newer and smaller. From your perspective, where can these smaller, newer players start creating, or what should they do to start creating compelling messages or it is compelling messaging that starts putting them on the map and enables customers to be able to engage with them or see them as even an alternative?
I think, again, I think this applies to most sectors. Again, I think personalization is super key. I think it's going to be so important, again, for all brands. I think, in South Africa, and I think speaking to Roger's point, I mean, people are looking, I think, to 5G. And even in South Africa, we've got some of the smaller competitors. I mean, obviously, we've got like Vodacom, MTN are kind of more your giants, but you've got the guys like Rain or Liquid, that are coming in trying to offer something that's a bit more exciting, new and shiny. So I think 5G is definitely going to be a buzzword. I think that people are going to want to jump onto. And I think because of the exciting things that it brings with it, the stuff we've spoken about, like in terms of AR, VR, autonomous driving cars, the Internet of Things, I think it opens up a world of opportunities. And I think smaller players can probably learn a lot from, looking at big guys like Verizon, for example, just in terms of the type of messaging that they put out, again, really showing consumers the value that it adds in their lives. But also, considering, I think, different ways in. So, again, you look at Verizon and the announcement they made at CES with their partnership with Disney. And I think we're going to see a lot more of this type of partnership evolving in the future with brands, I think, looking at the idea of content to connect with consumers rather than just the product. So again, I think trying to find an interesting way in, trying to find a relevant partner, I think, that could be a really interesting approach, because again, I think you're intersecting that consumer's life in a way that really matters to them, as opposed to, just having another product, because, I think it is a bit commoditized, it's a bit of a race to the bottom just in terms of price, and everyone pretty much offers the same thing based on the infrastructure we have. So I think you have to try and find a different way in, would be my advice.
We've got a question. We've got a question on YouTube from Nico, who is asking, or at least curious to know, what your thoughts are on TikTok, or how brands can or should be utilizing TikTok. Though, I mean, that's not. I guess it's not something that is fully related, but it's important.
Yeah. So again, I think, I think brands shouldn't just use a platform for the sake of ticking a box. I think very often everyone thinks, oh, okay, it's a new platform, we need to use it. I think, again, you need to go, is this relevant for our brand? I think you need to look at the target audience that is on TikTok and the type of content that's being featured there. So I would say, if you're a makeup brand, for example, TikTok makes sense. There's a lot of that sort of content on there. And so I think, it's a relevant platform to intersect. I think the users on TikTok are quite young. So again, if that's your target audience, if that's who you're trying to reach, then I think it makes sense. The tricky thing, though, for brands at the moment is that advertising hasn't really opened up in South Africa with TikTok. I mean, they're still working some stuff out. I mean, we recently did a project with TikTok to essentially launch it in South Africa. And so we're obviously quite close to the guys in Hong Kong and chat to them. So I think, I think it really does depend on the product and the brand, but I wouldn't say that it's a catch-all for everyone, that everyone should be using it. And obviously, I mean, we look at Instagram with Reels, and they're obviously trying to compete with TikTok, offering a very similar type of format. And so I'm seeing a lot more brands actually jump on that because they've already got, the users, the reach, the right target audiences. It still offers quite a similar experience in terms of content. So I think that would be my advice with regards to TikTok.
Yeah. Raj, I mean, Verizon just came up now, but you also mentioned, developments that are coming from across our borders that are coming through. And we are also starting to see that competition, or at least there's talk of competition coming from some of the some unexpected areas, like Facebook also wanting to set up satellites or enable connectivity or broadband specifically on the African continent. Do you predict that we'll start seeing competition from some unexpected areas in the telecommunications space?
Most definitely so, and I think it is interesting that TikTok was brought up because I have a 12-year-old daughter, and she spends probably, I hate to say it, maybe 5 hours on TikTok, and that's her medium. She's not on Facebook. Facebook is for people. So here's the point: that is the entry into their world is through these apps and content delivery platforms. So Apple TV, Apple has launched it's Apple One. Facebook is going out in that. Amazon has a big play in that, and all those are coming to Africa and South Africa. Now, at the moment, I would go as far as saying, unless you have a cheap fixed fiber connection, it's almost impossible to consume and participate in that economy, even for advertisers, right? She's fortunate we have a fiber link, so she can do that for 3-5 hours or whatever. It's impossible to do that without 5G. So in a way, 5G is the savior. Of course, the pricing points of those are still to be established by the service providers, but the benefits of 5G is that it'll offer high speed, big capacity at affordable prices, and that still needs to be done. In terms of innovation, okay, the innovation, regrettably, I would love to say startups are able to do so, but at the telco level, scale is what's critical, and scale comes with big pockets, big money, regulatory compliance requirements, and therefore, in a way, it's impossible to innovate. The innovation happens in the level on top of it, which is on the application. When we look at things like sporting events now, which obviously has been not happening for 6 to 8 months, places like in the US with the NFL and the NBA are moving into virtual reality and augmented reality. Where literally you feel as if you are in the stadium. You are, we'll all agree, and I'm a big Liverpool supporter, said, watching the game without spectators is not great. It's not great. They're trying to make it seem as if there's sound and, activity, but it's not great. If we had the ability to be, embedded into that in a AR or VR manner, it would help us. But at the moment, it's almost impossible to do that, for instance, on your phone because of the costs happening. So, but the innovation is going to happen. So Facebook, is going to come up with, and they are big into VR. Apple, with its new iPhone 12 and its apps are again big into that. Once the devices become cost-effective, cheap, ubiquitous, the application is going to follow. The application will follow the devices at the moment, and we're still not there with critical mass to make things affordable with things like Oculus and Go and a variety of different things that are out there. But entrepreneurs, if they're listening on the call as well, keep chipping away, building the capabilities, understanding clients and what consumers want, and the technologies will actually come to the fore, and the connectivity will come to the fore that will allow them to capitalize it, because there's some interesting things that can be done in Africa, and very specific to Africa as well.
One of the things that's, that has come up, Melody, or at least keeps coming up, especially in the telecommunications space, is the amount of data that they're able to collect on users, on user habits, and everywhere else, right? So that enables telecommunications companies to have a lot more intelligence on their part, for both for communication and product innovation. Are you starting to see any interesting uses of insights in terms of the data that's collected for communication, even for product innovation in this space?
I mean, again, I feel like I'm saying the same thing over and over. But I think the whole point of data is for personalization, right? Sure. Because essentially what you want to do is understand as much as you can about your consumer. So look at those data signals and then take those data signals and apply them to your product, your messaging, and then obviously target the consumer in the right moment. So I think, focusing on this first, I think, is really important for advertisers when it comes to building personalization strategies. So, I mean, something that I always do is always have this formula where I go, okay, great, what's the message, what's the medium, and what's the moment? And looking at the formula of those three, I think when you get the perfect mix of those three in terms of who you're trying to target, I think that's when you start to win. And, you look at the audience signals, the first and third party data sources, any other contextual information you can get, location, and then also looking at the different channels, their capabilities for personalization. I think all of this starts to make for quite an interesting space for brands to play in. However, it takes a lot of time. It's quite time consuming, and time equals money. So it can be quite expensive. And so I think there are not a lot of brands that have kind of started to play in more of that precision marketing space. But I definitely think it's where we're headed. And I think more and more so, I think everyone will kind of cotton on to that.
Okay, that makes, because I think some parts of this product innovation also comes from intelligence that's coming through from a marketing and advertising side that then influences brand development, or at least product development at brand. So we're just wondering if we're starting to see that influencing product innovation at brand level, or is it still that the brands innovate, telecommunications brands, fiber, whoever, do their own thing and then drive that to their agency and say, communicate this, or does it also happen the other way around more and more?
I think it's a bit of both. So I think, obviously you need to be aware of what is important to your consumers, otherwise you're irrelevant. So obviously saying what consumers are saying, what their needs are, and obviously trying to anticipate that. But I think generally the market will follow, the consumer. So, I mean, to the point of obviously looking at COVID, what happened was, I guess, forced digital transformation for most companies, for most brands. So you saw a lot more traditional brands, retailers, for example, going, okay, great, we need to innovate. We need to, go e-commerce. We need to go online. We need to look at ways to pivot our business. So I think naturally brands will innovate according to, what consumer needs are. But I think, I would hope that every brand, is paying attention to what matters to their consumers, looking at social listening, and then, innovating according to that. I mean, obviously there will be innovation that happens for innovation's sake, like at a brand level. But generally, I mean, I think obviously we follow the consumers and try to track what's important to them and adapt accordingly. Yeah.
All right. Sam, you've been following the Competition Commission and its recommendations closely over the past couple of months on ITWeb in your stories. And the Competition Commission has recommended that MTN and Vodacom relook at their pricing, have you noticed any changes from some of the smaller players, aside from the top brands that are being more competitive in from the pricing perspective, as well as from how they are playing in the market following these recommendations by the Competition Commission?
For me, I think the pricing dynamics, they are likely to stabilize in the near term as operators try to absorb these recent price reductions. Then you have guys like Saatchi, who are obviously smaller players and their financial challenge in terms of their position. But in terms of, I think we've started to see a bit of price cuts, and this price reduction, I think they will continue as more additional spectrum is getting deployed, which will reduce the cost of the capacity on the network due to the growing increase of data demand. So I think with more spectrum being deployed, we are going to see more pricing stabilizing in the near future. But yes, we have seen some price cuts in the most recently since the Comcom announced its decision to get the operators reduce the cost.
Are brands like, Rain, that's also extremely, very active, especially on the pricing side, and also, Telkom as well. Besides the top three, being Vodacom, MTN, and Saatchi, is there anything that is worth looking out for at the moment from some of these smaller players that's coming up in your research and what you're seeing from their communicators, their CEOs, and their leadership?
I think the issue right now is the issue of spectrum. Once we get the license starts being issued, I think we'll see more and more stability in terms of pricing. Yes, we have seen them reduce some prices, especially in the prepaid data segment. There's been some price reductions there. But now it's all in the regulatory matters that are outstanding, which is the licensing of spectrum. I think as we get more spectrum, I think the pricing will stabilize. That is what I get from the sense of people that I've been engaging with.
Yeah. And Raj, from your side, how do you see spectrum and the further introduction of 5G influencing the industry?
So last year, ICASA came up with a model called the Wireless Open Access Network, where they wanted an operator to own the new spectrum on a shared service basis, open access basis, and basically sell that capacity then, once created, to existing players as well as smaller players. For all intents and purposes, it looks like that model is no longer going to happen. And when the auction for 5G takes place, the only bidders for it and companies capable of acquiring it will be the top three. The three that you mentioned, the usual suspects, MTN, Vodacom, and Saatchi. The others are just not going to have the pockets and the capacity to be able to do that. The obligations are just too severe. So as Sam said, we're going back to square one. And what will happen essentially is the incumbents will then decide how much profits they want to leave on the table. And in other words, they will determine the price. Regrettably, I do not see how the likes of Telkom and Rain are actually going to actively be able to influence pricing of data in South Africa.
What new trends are you noticing, Melody? New and growing ones are you noticing that you think will take us into 2021? I mean, you mentioned advertising earlier, and I'd like you to get into a little bit more around what that means and how that plays out, for people who are not in the communications industry. But what other ones are you noting will take us into 2021 and beyond? Especially seeing as we've had such an unpredictable year where everything that was predicted as a trend coming into 2020 has now been, rendered null and void.
So I think we're just going to see digital continuing to grow, and sadly, more of the traditional players, I think, becoming less relevant. I mean, we're even seeing it now. I think, all the streaming services that are becoming quite commonplace. I think back in the day, I used to use a VPN to try to watch Netflix, whereas obviously now it's everywhere. And so I think we're going to see more and more of that. And I think as a result as well, I think, obviously when I think, there is more data access in South Africa, I mean, especially when 5G starts becoming commonplace, I think that's going to be really interesting. I think, homes being connected. So I think the connected home is also going to be an interesting trend. And I think, unfortunately, obviously in South Africa, based on infrastructure, obviously based on the economy and where we're at, I think it will take a bit longer for that to happen here. But, obviously there is the 1%, the top million in South Africa, I think that will try to drive that sort of change. So I think we'll see a lot of that. But as I said, I don't think digital is going anywhere from an advertising perspective with brands. But I think the challenge will be how to essentially, do it better than your competitor. And again, like looking at that personalization, I think it's going to be quite challenging though, with I guess the impending death of the cookie. I think it's going to restrict a lot of the ability to personalize across the web. And, you look at your walled garden platforms, Facebook, Google, etc. And, they're great environments for personalization, but it's tricky to really track that consumer journey and to understand where they are, at in terms of your messaging cycle and how you can intersect. So, yeah, I think that's going to be an interesting challenge, I think, that we're going to see in 2021. But exciting. And hey, let's see. Hopefully there's no crazy wave 2 of COVID, etc. Because I think that brings its own challenges as well, unfortunately.
I mean, you mentioned connected devices there, and I think that's going to be that's the next part of our discussion. How are brands starting to rethink their strategy or add the fact that there'll be more and more connected devices and customize and personalize their messaging even more, because customization and personalization is a theme that keeps coming up in the conversation.
100%. As I said, again, I think it depends on the brand and who your target consumer is. So when you're looking at more mass, audience South Africa or, the emerging middle, I think perhaps a little less so, just because it does take so much time for that infrastructure to develop in South Africa, and there's obviously cost barriers. But when you're looking at the sort of top million in South Africa, 100%, I think there is that desire for, the next new thing. So, the connected home. I mean, I think a lot of people already have, Google Assistants at home, or whether they have, Alexas or whatever the case is. And I think we're going to see more and more of that. People having smart light bulbs and, essentially talking to their homes. Because I think we're also time starved. And so we're looking for convenience. We're looking for ways to make our lives better and easier. So I think we're going to see a lot of brands trying to tap into that. And as a result, also figuring out how they can communicate in, I think, interesting and unexpected ways based on that.
Okay. Sam, where does this advent of or growth of connected devices take us in terms of our access to connectivity and the need for more fiber?
I think the issue of connected device, it has been growing elsewhere worldwide, and South Africa is no exception. And we've seen that, I think if you look at even municipalities, they're using connected electric meters. You go into mines, there's IoT. You go almost each and every other industry, there's IoT. So I think this presents an opportunity as well for telecommunications in terms of data, which again goes back to the issue of spectrum. So I think now the growing demand for the connected device will also push the telecoms guys in terms of data pricing, as well as push the regulator to release more spectrum. That's how I look at it.
Yeah. Your take on that one, Raj?
Yeah, I think there's a growing gap between the expectations of consumers, the public, and what's being delivered by the ecosystem. As Sam said, there's shortcomings. We should be well beyond talking about spectrum at the moment. And one of the audiences we have not even discussed about in this webinar is the rural communities, the underprivileged, and increasingly they are going to be left out of this discussion because, the discussions we are having now, with VR and content are, in the gigs, and they are still talking about megabytes, and the pricing is on megabyte level. I'm just disappointed we cannot get, and government basically has failed and not come to the party, and the regulators. This thing should have been resolved long ago. Now, even when the President Cyril Ramaphosa instructs the minister saying we need it fast, that gets delayed till March of next year, just for the tender to come out or whatever. Yeah. I mean, to be quite honest, it's beyond ridiculous. If we had a free market economy type system, let the consumers decide, what they are willing to want and what they're willing to pay for it.
And and I think we should discuss the rural communities and how much access they also get. But in closing, because we've got like 3 minutes left, I'm realizing, starting with you, Melody, where should the telecommunications brands going into 2021 with more competition coming in be focused? Where should they focus their communication and, I suppose, their budgets as well?
Look, I think there is still a role to play for traditional media in South Africa. We saw that spend went. Hello? Hi, can I keep going?
Go ahead, Melody.
Okay, great. So I was saying, I think, there is still a role for traditional media in South Africa, especially with regards to your more mass middle market, but digital is not going anywhere. So I think considering that in your marketing mix is going to be highly important. And obviously, as I've spoken about, I think like 100 times in this session, looking at how you can personalize based on who it is that you're speaking to. So I think, that's going to be important. I think regardless of sector, I think for all brands, I think that's an important strategy. And my message to the telecoms guys would be, figure out your pricing structure and make our lives a little bit easier. Because again, Raj brought up a really important point, and I think connectivity should almost be a human right. So how do we get that across to the more rural areas in South Africa and to mass markets? Because I think that would be really important. So that's about it.
All right. And I think, that will also help the networks themselves become even more relevant or remain relevant in a hugely competitive industry. And to you, Sam, as well, in terms of just the closing remarks, what are you seeing as trends that are taking us into 2021 from both the big players and with the opening up of spectrum and smaller players coming in?
I think going forward, we can't ignore the impact of COVID. That first of all, it has exposed actually the degree of readiness of the industry in terms of digital revolution. We've tested the resilience of telecoms infrastructure in supporting digital revolution and all things digital. So I think going forward, now that we know that most of the things are now going digital, so the issue of data again will become central to all the trends that will be coming in the coming year or going forward. And I think for the telcos in terms of business, there will also be a bit of expansion into the adjacent markets. Case in point, you can look at MTN's mobile money offerings. Vodacom is pushing in the video play. And both of them, they've really amassed numbers. Vodacom, I think, has got about 2 million subscribers, while, MTN has got 2 million subscribers on their mobile money. Vodacom is recording about 1 million mark for their video, which I think it's going to be a growing trend where telcos, they'll be focusing more on the adjacent markets. But again, also that requires spectrum. That requires more spectrum.
Yeah. All right, thank you for that. Raj, I mean, again, to you as well, what trends and also innovations, because you work, I mean, a lot in the space of, innovations that are coming into various markets, and you're seeing that quite a lot. What trends do you think will take us into 2021 and beyond, seeing as, COVID has also changed the markets and industries so much? Where are we going, both from telecommunications and also other startups and things that are bubbling under as unexpected competition in this market?
So as final remarks, telecommunications is a right, is a utility, and it's a right. The ecosystem, including regulators and service providers, have to figure out how to do that in the most practical and quick manner. Innovation is going to happen at the apps layer. When I'm talking apps, I'm talking about financial services, I'm talking about content, I'm talking about sports. It's everything that sits on top of the telecoms layer, and that's where the innovation is going to happen. That's where the upstarts can make a difference, bring in community projects that are relevant, to that, using technologies that utilized like AI and blockchain, IoT, which was mentioned earlier. So in essence, I think there's a lot of possibilities, but the possibility exists in the layer on top of the telecommunications layer. And the telecommunications industry should basically get along and do what they need to do to enable that innovation to happen.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for your time and for your insights. I mean, I think the biggest themes that have come up for me that I've picked up is that customization is going to be massive with competition coming in. The big players need to, I guess, innovate more, be more inclusive as well, in order to get rural communities in there as well. So I think I'm absolutely with you on that one, as well as the fact that we need to start having more and more conversations that include or are more inclusive and consider the needs of our rural communities, because they seem to be on the fringes and they seem to not get mentioned in any of these conversations. So absolutely on that one. Thank you very much for joining us, and to everybody on YouTube, thank you very much. We see your question there, Francois. We just couldn't ask the question right now with regards to what the political climate in the US means for Huawei, as well as apps like Google and Facebook. But yeah, we'll try to answer that, but we can't answer that now because we've run out of time. Thank you very much, Melody, Raj, Samuel.